Grüß, willkommen in einem aufregendes video. Welcome to yet another exciting video, in this case part 27 of my Star Trek TOS timeline series videos. In this video I'll discuss what we know about Vulcan and the Vulcanians, or Vulcans. Of all the aliens in Star Trek, we possess the most information about the Vulcans, but I must admit, even so, it's pretty minimal. As is my practice, let's look at the references in the TOS script and attempt to create a coherent view of this enigmatic people. We learn in the episode The Man Trap that Vulcan does not have a moon. In the episode Operation Annihilate, we learn the sun of Vulcan is very bright. Perhaps it is a semi-desert planet. In the episode The Immunity Syndrome, we discover within Vulcan collective memory they know of no conqueror. Perhaps this means no one has ever conquered Vulcan from another planet. In the Savage Curtain, the Vulcans use a boomerang type of weapon, probably used in ancient time as it's a rather low-tech weapon. In Amok Time, we learn the Vulcans in the past were very violent and would kill in order to win a mate. They were the ultimate alpha males. In Let That Be Your Last Battlefield, we learn Vulcan almost destroyed itself before it adopted its logical pacifist philosophy. In The Journey to Babel, we learn the Vulcans are pacifists, but I assume this is tempered by logic, so they understand sometimes fighting is required. Otherwise, why bother man a starship? The Vulcans also have a technique which is used for execution, the Tal Shaya, so much for an aversion to violence. In the Savage Curtain, we discover about Surak. Surak is the father of Vulcan, obviously a pacifist, who lived during the 4th century, which I assume is Earth century. While not contained in the episode, Memory Alpha claims Surak lived in the 4th century, which I assume must be an Earth century. This is sometime between 300 and 399 AD. As Vulcans could live for a long time, I can assume he was born in 300 AD and lived through the entire century. However, I suspect this may not be the case at this time point. On the other hand, I suspect Surak was one of the first Vulcans to be able to live this long, as we'll discuss later. Why, that is. In the episode Amok Time, we learn Spock's family held its land for over 2,000 years, which is earlier than 264 BC. He must have come from a very important family. This is even before Surak was born, which occurred 300-399 AD. So this must be a very old family reaching back into the times of violent Vulcan history. In the Balance of Terror and also the Enterprise incident, we learn the Vulcans, or Romulans, are an offshoot of the Vulcan race. A good question is, when did the Romulans leave Vulcan? I would assume it would have occurred during the period of war in order to allow all records to be lost, basically in the time of Surak or just before. If the Romulans had primitive space drive, which took many years to arrive at Romulus, they could have arrived there in 400 AD. This gives the Romulans about 1600 years to colonise and populate their primary planet and then start expanding into space, meeting the Terran expansion, which results in war. While this theory is a stretch, in order to work I have to assume the lifespan of the Romulans were less than those of the Vulcans, at least modern Vulcans. Perhaps the long travel in radiation-filled space affected their lifespan, or perhaps, more likely, when they left Vulcan, they did not have such a long lifespan. To populate Romulus in 1600 years, it would need a much shorter time span, unless Romulan women acted as baby machines, which I doubt. While the Vulcans and Romulans are similar, there are some differences. I suspect the Romulans lack the physical strength and stamina of the Vulcans. Perhaps Vulcan's strength and stamina is related to their mental discipline, something the Romulans lack. In Journey to Babel, McCoy talks about the Vulcan salute. The Vulcans form a V with their fingers and as a sign of greeting or farewell. In the episode Error and Mercy, we learn Vulcan traders are not uncommon. I suspect it was Vulcan traders which first made contact with the Earth. This is a wild guess with minimal references, but to make first contact possible, the following sequence of events could have occurred. Because the Botany Bay is launched into interstellar space, the Vulcan ship notices it, backtracks it to its origin, and makes first contact with Earth. This could have been later than 1997, but 1997 is the earliest possible date of Vulcan-Earth first contact. We know the Vulcan traders are common, so first contact was probably almost certainly Vulcan traders. In this scenario, the Vulcans are using impulse drive as an interesting point. In Metamorphoses, Cochrane recognises a Vulcan, so he must have been aware of them when he disappeared in 2117. We learn in the Immunity Syndrome, the Vulcans manned at least one of the 12 main starships of the Federation, the Intrepid. In this episode, they were all killed by some single-celled amoeba-type creature. In Journey to Babel, we learn the Vulcans have a Vulcan Science Academy, which is considered more important than entering Starfleet. So, based on these references, in summary, we know Vulcan has no moon, and its sun is very bright, requiring Vulcans to evolve in a manner which allowed them to protect their eyes. I suppose a bright sun could mean the planet is hot and semi-desert, which seems to be the assumption subsequent series use, and even in Amok time the planet looks rather dry. My wild guess is the climate and terrain is probably similar to that of Israel or perhaps the Sinai. I expect such a harsh environment had created a very robust race. Possibly part of the strength of the Vulcans comes from this harsh environment. I'm uncertain if a race could evolve in this manner in such a harsh environment. After all, the Bedouins do not possess super strength, so I don't feel the harsh climate was the cause of Vulcan's strength and stamina. Early Vulcans were a very violent people, apparently killing in order to obtain a mate, being the most extreme example of this. A better example is their use of a boomerang-like weapon in the early period, which can kill other people. We can assume that without logic, the Vulcans may be a tad more emotional and violent than even humans. Perhaps the Romulans are a better view of what these early Vulcans were actually like. The Vulcans must have developed technology while in this violent state, as the Romulans must have been able to get away in interstellar craft. During the period, the Vulcans were almost destroying themselves. Perhaps there were two main political blocs which almost destroyed each other in warfare, forcing the Vulcans to adopt their pacifism and logic. For a race to change so dramatically, I expect they must have become close to obliterating their civilization. Perhaps this occurred back in 300 to 399 AD. If this theory is correct, the Romulans would have needed to get away first, while their civilization possessed the technology to do so, that is, before Surak. The other alternative is the Romulans left because they refused to adopt this logical philosophy, but in order to create the Romulan Star Empire they needed as much time as possible, so this needs to occur as early as possible. I suspect they left before it got so bad that Surak had to step in with such a demanding philosophy, so I don't think this alternative theory is viable. Once the Vulcans adopted their logic pacifist philosophy, they quickly rebuilt their civilization, went out to develop their loose trading association or network. I'm uncertain when this did occur. We know the Vulcans had never been conquered by any race in living memory, so external threat was probably not the issue or the reason. Perhaps it's a result of the trauma of almost destroying their own civilization and having knowledge of other races. Perhaps it was their desire to spread their philosophy. Perhaps it was due to their logic. They knew eventually a threat would arise, so better be proactive. The final possible reason is the pinnacle of their society seemed to be the Vulcan Science Academy, which could be the reason why they went into space to explore. They were seeking knowledge, and perhaps coming as traders gave them more access to other alien societies. This is a long shot, but it could be the most logical reason for their expansion. Let's now look at the Vulcan race itself and their unique biological characteristics. In the Cloudminders, we learn the Vulcan mating cycle is 7 years. This is a very long time between bonks. In Amok time, we learn when the Vulcans are in heat, they become very emotional and violent, and if they cannot mate, they die. I find the quote in The Naked Time rather disturbing, but according to Nurse Chapel, the men from Vulcan treat their women strangely, at least people say that. But you're part human too. I know you don't. You couldn't hurt me, would you? I have no idea what's going on here and prefer to just say the Vulcan men may get a bit rough when in heat. So much for the mating habits of the Vulcans, which in the hypersexed world of Star Trek, I suppose I had no choice but to discover. We learn very early in the TV series that the Vulcans control their emotions. Basically, the first proper episode, although the second episode. This is clearly stated also in Mudd's Woman. In the episode Court Martial, we learned the Vulcans are governed by logic and Vulcanians do not speculate. In Dagger of the Mind, we learned the Vulcans can probe another person's mind. This is also mentioned in several more episodes listed in the top right corner. Vulcans can also create a mental shield against someone else probing their mind. This allowed Spock to protect herself from the Klingon mind probe device in Errant of Mercy. In A Taste of Armageddon, we learn the Vulcans have limited telepathic abilities over distance. The Vulcans have almost superhuman self-control and can disregard pain, even extreme pain, for long periods of time. I'm actually uncertain if this is correct, and I'm uncertain what it actually means, but in the Menagerie we learn the Vulcans cannot be disloyal. In the episode The Deadly Years, a Vulcan is still robust when 100, but has slowed down to an extent. Perhaps this is similar to Human 50, if not slightly earlier. In the episode Journey to Babel, we learn Sarek is 102 years old, which means he was born shortly after the Federation was formed in 2161, and just before the SS Archon was destroyed at Beta 3. Sarek is retiring at an unusually young age for a Vulcan. According to Memory Alpha, Sarek, father of Spock, was born in 2156, as a side note. So, nonetheless, 100 may be a little bit old for a Vulcan, but certainly not old enough for a Vulcan to retire. So I think that it probably is equivalent to the age 50 in a human. Also in the Journey to Babel episode, we learned the Vulcans have significant greater stamina than humans. This is also raised in a number of other episodes. The Vulcans can also use their minds to force heal parts of their bodies if they're mentally capable of doing so. In the Paradise Syndrome, we learn Vulcans can, if required, go without sleep for weeks, but there is an impact on their health. While Vulcan's strength and stamina is greater than human, it depends on their brains, according to McCoy in the episode Spock's Brain. Spock's body is more dependent on that tremendous brain for life support. Putting the mating cycle to one side, it's clear that the Vulcans place a lot of effort into control of their own minds, which gives them the ability to heal themselves, disregard pain, not sleep for weeks, and so on. Not sleep for weeks, and so on. It's possible the greater stamina and strength is due to this unusual level of control, as the Romulans do not seem to have anywhere the same abilities as Vulcans, at least in the TOS script. Perhaps even the lifespan is affected by their great level of mind controls. If so, perhaps Sarek gained his power, political power, because he displayed all these benefits as a byproduct of his philosophy. We know that biologically the difference between Vulcans and Romulans is minimal. However, it does exist, but as the Romulans show no evidence of long lifespans, greater stamina, mind control, and so on, that could be a result of Surek's philosophy, which is not biological. That is the difference between Vulcans and Romulans. Could explain why Surek's philosophy of logic and pacifism won out against those who were violent. The logical Vulcans were simply able to outthink and outlast their violent brethren. Surek is a pivotal figure in Vulcan history, and I suspect understanding how his philosophy spread may give some critical clues concerning the differences between the Romulans and Vulcans and why Vulcan history unfurled in the way it did later. We know Surek was a pacifist, but as we saw in the Savage Curtain, by itself it has little hope of ever surviving, that is, being purely pacifistic, much less growing. The concept of resorting to violence as a last resort is logical, but I think this is a key to Surek's philosophy, but it's not the whole story. Assuming Surek was born in 200 AD, I feel he must have witnessed an act of emotion-fueled violence which left a deep scar on his psyche. Surek may have been driven to find a better way, and I feel his first objective was to develop a philosophy which allowed him to control his emotions, which he succeeded. This may have spread, as a Vulcan who was able to control his emotion represents an effective survival trait in a high-tech world. Remember, the world of Surek must have included spacecraft and high-tech, so the initial survival benefits that made emotional outbursts useful was no longer useful and is actually a negative. By controlling your emotions, Surek probably developed his logic focus, as once your mind is clear of the biology of emotion, pure thought may have arisen. I suspect some Vulcans already had this ability, as otherwise they would not have been able to develop technology, but the ability to control emotion would have enhanced this. Once Surek's sect had developed their twin philosophy of emotional control and logic, they would have gained a significant advantage against the emotional-fueled fools which populated Vulcan. This would have allowed his sect to grow. The offshoot of being able to control your emotion, which requires the ability to control your own biology, would have been a host of other benefits. The ability to ignore pain, the ability to heal your body, and with sufficient development, most likely the ability to live longer. As an offshoot, it allowed the Vulcans to develop their mind meld and telepathic abilities as well. I believe when Surik was born, the lifespan of Vulcans was similar to humans, possibly less due to a high level of violence. When Surik developed his philosophy, this allowed him to enhance his lifespan as well as increase his stamina and strength. This would have given Surik's sect an irresistible benefit over other Vulcans. If a Vulcan wanted to be healthier, stronger and live longer, they needed to adopt Surik's philosophy. It would have been irresistible. For those unable to master this technique, they ensured their children, or would have ensured their children, could have started training at an early age, so that at least their dependents could benefit from this. Eventually, Vulcan society would have mandated this training for all children. As for pacifism, it's always logical to avoid violence in achieving your aim. Even Sun Tzu indicated the greatest victory was one which was achieved without any bloodshed. If there is no alternative to violence, the Vulcans, or at least Spock, has no issues with resorting to violence, but only as a last resort. The classic example was in Balance of Terror, where once Spock discovered the Romulans were an offshoot of the Vulcan race, he suggested the Romulan ship had to be destroyed, otherwise the galaxy would be plunged into war. This is the critical difference from the popular impression that we have of a classic pacifist who believes everyone inside is a teddy bear and as long as you are nice, they will be nice in return. The Vulcan pacifism is rooted in reality, and when Vulcan logic determines that a peaceful approach would result in more violence downstream, they have no issues with acting with rapid and extreme violence. As Spock said, the life of one is worth more than the life of many. Of course, the Romulans did not benefit from this philosophy of logic, which explains their different behaviour, although I suspect they were probably a lot more moderate and less violent than the original violent Vulcans. The only area Surik could not change was mating. He probably wisely left that one alone, although the result is Star Trek can't help itself but let us know all about the gory details, which in retrospect I really wish they didn't. And so we come to the end of part 27 of my Star Trek TOS timeline, in this case discussing Vulcan and the people of Vulcan. The episode scripts can be found using the URLs shown. Alle guten Dingen kommen zu einem Ende.